Can I sit here? A sickly little 6-year-old girl said to the stranger, not knowing he was a childless millionaire. What she said made him cry. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Robert Harrison had spent 43 years building an empire, but today he felt like the loneliest man in America. The sterile waiting room of St. Mary's Children's Hospital in Boston smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. He clutched the medical report in his weathered hands. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8 if he was lucky. At 67, Bob had everything money could buy: a mansion in Beacon Hill, a fleet of luxury cars, and a company worth $200 million. But he had no one to leave it to. His beloved wife Catherine had died in a car accident 15 years ago, and they'd never been blessed with children. Now, facing his own mortality, the weight of a lifetime spent building wealth instead of relationships pressed down on him like a stone. He'd come to this hospital hoping to find meaning in his final months, perhaps through charitable donation. But sitting here among worried parents and crying families, he felt more like an intruder than a savior. "Excuse me, sir." The tiny voice startled him from his dark thoughts. Bob looked up to see a little girl with the biggest brown eyes he'd ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, wearing pink pajamas decorated with cartoon unicorns. A colorful knit cap covered her head, but wisps of what looked like very thin hair peeked out around the edges. Her skin had that translucent quality that spoke of serious illness, yet her smile could have lit up the entire hospital. "Can I sit here?" she asked, pointing to the empty chair beside him. "Mommy's talking to the doctors, and all the other chairs have people crying. You look sad, but you're not crying, so maybe we can be sad together." Bob's throat constricted. In all his years of business meetings, hostile takeovers, and high-stakes negotiations, nothing had ever hit him quite like this moment. This brave little soul, clearly fighting her own battle, was worried about comforting him. "Of course, sweetheart," he managed, his voice rougher than usual. "What's your name?" "I'm Margaret, but everyone calls me Maggie," she said, climbing carefully into the chair. "I'm 6 3/4, which is practically 7. What's your name?" I'm Bob," he replied, watching as she arranged herself with the careful precision of someone who'd spent too much time in hospitals. "It's very nice to meet you, Maggie." She studied his face with the intensity only children possess. "Are you here because someone you love is sick?" The question pierced through every defense he'd built over decades. Bob found himself nodding, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Me too," Maggie whispered, reaching over to pat his hand with her small one. "I'm the sick person my mommy loves. But you know what I learned? Sometimes being sad together makes it hurt a little less." And that's when Robert Harrison, millionaire businessman, corporate titan, and master of his own destiny, began to cry. Not the quiet tears of private grief, but the deep, soul-shaking sobs of a man who'd just discovered he wasn't alone in the world after all. And as this sick little girl held his hand in the waiting room of a children's hospital, Bob realized his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. But what Maggie said next would reveal a secret that would turn everything upside down. "Maggie, there you are!" A woman's voice called across the waiting room, filled with relief and exhaustion that only a mother living in constant fear could understand. Bob watched as a woman in her early 30s hurried toward them, moving with the determined grace of someone who'd learned to be strong when everything else was falling apart. Despite her obvious fatigue, there was something luminous about her. The kind of inner strength that emerges when someone loves another person more than their own life. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her clothes, faded jeans and a worn Boston University sweatshirt, spoke of someone who'd been living in hospitals for too long, someone who'd learned that appearance mattered far less than presence. "I'm so sorry," she said to Bob, slightly out of breath, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I hope she wasn't bothering you. Maggie has this way of making friends with everyone she meets. I'm always telling her not to talk to strangers, but... She gestured helplessly, and Bob could see the eternal struggle of a mother trying to balance protection with her child's naturally loving spirit. Not at all, Bob replied, standing up and extending his hand with the same formal courtesy he'd use in a boardroom, though something about this moment felt infinitely more important than any business deal. I'm Bob Harrison. Your daughter is absolutely remarkable. I'm Sarah Chen, she said, accepting his handshake with a grip that was surprisingly firm. Her wedding ring was notably absent, but a thin band of pale skin on her finger suggested it hadn't been gone long. And yes, she certainly is remarkable. Sometimes I think she's the one taking care of me instead of the other way around. The comment was made lightly, but Bob caught the deeper truth beneath it, the weight of single parenthood combined with a child's serious illness, the way children sometimes became wise beyond their years when facing mortality too early. Can Mr. Bob come with us to see Dr. Martinez? Maggie had wrapped her small arms around Bob's leg with the unconscious trust that only children possess. He's sad like we are, and I think he needs to hear good news too. Sarah's cheeks flushed deeper, and Bob could see her internal struggle, the embarrassment of her daughter's boldness warring with something else, something that looked almost like hope. Maggie, Mr. Harrison has his own appointments to get to. We can't just... Actually, Bob heard himself saying, and the words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Sarah. I don't have anywhere urgent to be right now. It was a complete lie. He had a board meeting in 2 hours that would determine the fate of a $50 million acquisition, a meeting he'd been preparing for all week. But somehow, standing in this hospital waiting room with a 6-year-old's arms around his leg, those millions seemed as insignificant as pocket change. Sarah studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. Bob saw her taking in details, his expensive suit, his confident posture, the subtle signs of wealth and power. But he also saw something else in her expression, something that looked like recognition. A mother's instinct recognizing another wounded soul, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that sometimes strangers appeared in your life exactly when you needed them most. Well, she said slowly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and wariness, if you're absolutely sure you don't mind. As they walked toward the elevator, Maggie slipped her hand into Bob's with the same natural ease she might have with her own father. The gesture was so simple, so innocent, yet it sent a shockwave through Bob's carefully constructed world. When was the last time anyone had reached for him without wanting something in return? When had anyone's touch been motivated purely by affection rather than obligation or opportunity? Mr. Bob, Maggie said as the elevator doors closed around them, her voice carrying that particular directness that children use when asking the questions adults are too polite to voice. Do you have any kids of your own? The question hit Bob like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending a familiar ache through his chest. No, sweetheart, he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. I don't have any children. Maggie considered this with the serious expression she seemed to reserve for life's bigger mysteries. That's okay, she said matter-of-factly, as if she were commenting on the weather. Sometimes families come together in different ways, like puzzle pieces that find each other when you're not even looking for the right fit. Sarah shot Bob an apologetic look over Maggie's head, but he was too stunned by the child's wisdom to notice. This 6-year-old was teaching him about life and love, in ways his Harvard MBA and decades of business experience never could. But what Bob didn't know, as the elevator carried them toward Dr. Martinez's office, was that the doctor was about to deliver news that would change the trajectory of all their lives forever. Doctor, Martinez's office was a careful study in balancing professionalism with compassion. Medical diplomas and certificates hung alongside colorful drawings from young patients, and a large jar of rainbow lollipops sat prominently on his desk next to stacks of serious-looking medical files. The walls were painted a warm yellow that somehow managed to feel cheerful, without being dismissive of the gravity of the conversations that took place here daily. Bob positioned himself quietly in a corner chair, feeling like an intruder in this intimate family moment, yet unable to leave. He watched Sarah and Maggie settle into the chairs facing Dr. Martinez's desk, noting how Sarah's entire body seemed to brace itself for impact, while Maggie appeared more interested in a crayon drawing she'd apparently made during a previous visit. "I've reviewed the latest test results and scans, Doctor," Martinez began, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered difficult news too many times. Bob could see why families trusted this man. His eyes held genuine compassion, but his manner remained professionally steady. "I'm afraid the leukemia isn't responding to the current treatment protocol as well as we'd hoped." Bob watched Sarah's face maintain its careful composure even as her knuckles went white against the chair arms. It was a masterclass in controlled terror, the expression of a mother who'd learned to absorb devastating news without falling apart, at least not in front of her child. Maggie, meanwhile, seemed absorbed in adding details to her drawing, humming a soft, tuneless melody that somehow made the moment even more heartbreaking. "What does that mean exactly?" Sarah asked, and Bob admired the steadiness in her voice. "What are our options from here?" "Doctor." Martinez leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "There's an experimental treatment available at Boston Children's Research Center. It's shown very promising results in cases similar to Maggie's, and I believe she'd be an excellent candidate." He paused, and Bob could see him choosing his words carefully. "However, I need to be transparent about the financial reality. Even with your current insurance coverage, the out-of-pocket expenses would be approximately $80,000. Bob saw Sarah's slight flinch, so quick and subtle that he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her carefully. It was barely a movement, just the slightest tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible way her shoulders seemed to carry a heavier weight. He'd made that kind of money in a single afternoon of stock trading, but he could see it represented an impossible mountain for this family. "We'll find a way," Sarah said quietly, and there was something in her voice, not just determination, but the kind of fierce resolve that mothers summon when their children's lives hang in the balance. "We always do." After they left Dr. Martinez's office, Bob excused himself to make what he claimed was an urgent business call. In reality, within 3 minutes, he'd arranged for his assistant to transfer $80,000 anonymously to the hospital's financial department, specifically earmarked for Maggie Chen's treatment. It was the easiest, most instinctive decision he'd made in years, requiring no analysis or consideration of returns on investment. But when he returned to find Sarah and Maggie, he discovered Sarah in the hallway, speaking in hushed, desperate tones into her cell phone. "Mom, I know we've talked about this before, and I know how hard things have been since Dad died, but I need to ask again about the treatment costs." She paused, listening to whatever response came through the phone, and Bob could see her face crumple slightly before she composed herself again. No, of course I understand. I would never ask you to risk losing the house. We'll figure something else out. We always do." Bob's heart clenched as he watched this woman, who was clearly drowning financially, refuse to let her own mother sacrifice her security. Here was someone willing to exhaust every option, bear any burden, face any hardship for her daughter, but still unwilling to drag her family down with her. "Mr. Bob!" Maggie appeared beside him as if summoned by magic, tugging insistently on his jacket sleeve. "Want to see something really cool?" She led him to a large window overlooking the hospital's carefully maintained garden, pointing to a particularly gnarled old oak tree whose branches seemed to reach toward the sky in an almost human gesture. "See that tree? The one with the funny branches that look like arms? Mommy says it looks like it's dancing, like it's so happy to be alive that it can't help but move. She says even when things are really, really hard, we can still find beautiful things if we remember to look for them." Bob stared at the ancient oak, its branches indeed reaching skyward in what could only be described as a joyful dance. In all his years of looking at the world through spreadsheets and profit margins, when had he last stopped to see beauty in something that served no practical purpose? "Your mother is a very wise woman," he said softly. "Yeah, but she cries when she thinks I'm sleeping," Maggie replied, with the matter-of-fact honesty that children use when discussing the most heartbreaking truths. "I wish I could make her not worry about the money stuff. I heard her telling Grandma that she might have to sell Daddy's car." Bob's throat tightened. This child, facing her own battle with cancer, was worried about her mother's financial stress and the loss of what was probably one of the last tangible connections to her father. But what Maggie said next would reveal just how much she truly understood about the complex adult world swirling around her. That evening, Bob found himself in his cavernous Beacon Hill mansion, doing something he hadn't done in 15 years, attempting to cook an actual meal for himself. The kitchen, with its professional-grade appliances and granite countertops, had been designed for entertaining dozens of guests, but tonight it felt absurdly oversized for one man making scrambled eggs and toast. As he sat alone at his massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by empty chairs and expensive artwork that suddenly seemed cold and meaningless, Maggie's words about families and puzzle pieces echoed in his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed against the polished wood surface, a text from his assistant. "Board meeting rescheduled to tomorrow morning at 9. Also, the anonymous donation to St. Mary's Children's Hospital has been processed and will appear in their accounts within 24 hours. Bob smiled grimly as he read the message. Money had always been his solution to problems, his way of cutting through complications and achieving desired outcomes. But sitting in this tomb of a house, he was beginning to understand that some problems couldn't be solved with a wire transfer, and some of the most important things in life couldn't be purchased at any price. The next morning found him back at the hospital earlier than his own scheduled appointment, telling himself he was simply checking to ensure the donation had been processed correctly. But his feet carried him with purpose straight to the pediatric ward, and he knew he was lying to himself about his motivations. He discovered Maggie in the children's play area, constructing something elaborate and architecturally impressive with the oversized, colorful blocks provided for young patients. Sarah sat nearby, laptop balanced on her knees, clearly attempting to work despite the circumstances, probably trying to maintain some semblance of normal life and income while her world revolved around hospital schedules and treatment protocols. "Mr. Bob." Maggie's face illuminated with genuine joy when she spotted him, as if his arrival was the best possible start to her day. "Look what I'm building! It's really special." The structure was remarkably sophisticated for a 6-year-old's construction project, a house with multiple distinct rooms, careful attention to proportion and detail, and what appeared to be a central courtyard area. Bob settled himself down on one of the child-sized chairs, his expensive suit looking ridiculous in the whimsical play area, but not caring in the slightest. "Tell me about it," he said, genuinely fascinated by her creation. Maggie's expression grew serious, the way children look when they're about to share something they consider profoundly important. "It's a house for families that don't match the regular way," she explained, pointing to different sections of her block construction. See, this room over here is for the daddy who doesn't have any kids of his own, but who has a really big heart with lots of love stored up inside. And this room is for the mommy and little girl who don't have a daddy anymore, but who have enough love to share with someone new." Bob's breath caught in his throat as she continued her explanation. "And this big room in the middle," she said, indicating the central courtyard area, "this is where they all eat dinner together and watch movies and tell stories, and nobody ever has to be alone or scared anymore, because when people care about each other, it doesn't matter if they didn't start out as a regular family." Bob glanced over at Sarah, who had stopped pretending to work on her laptop and was listening to her daughter's words with an expression that mixed wonder with something that looked almost like fear. "That sounds like a very special house indeed," Bob managed, his voice thicker than usual. "What made you think of building something like this?" Maggie was quiet for a moment, arranging blocks with the focused concentration that only children possess when they're working through big ideas. "Yesterday, when you went to make your phone calls, I heard Mommy talking to Grandma on her phone," she said finally. "Mommy said she wished there was someone who could help us with the scary, expensive stuff, but that she's too proud to ask strangers for charity because that would make her feel like she wasn't taking good care of me." She looked up at Bob with those impossibly wise brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "But you're not a stranger anymore, are you, Mr. Bob? Yesterday you held my hand when I was sad, and you cried with me, and strangers don't do that. And it's not charity when people who really care about each other help each other, right? That's just what families do." Sarah had abandoned all pretense of working now, her laptop closed and set aside, her full attention focused on this conversation that seemed to be heading toward territory that would change all their lives. Bob felt something crack open in his chest, not the physical pain of his cancer, but something deeper and more fundamental. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart since Catherine's death, the barriers that had kept him safe and successful and utterly alone for 15 years. "Maggie," he said carefully, aware that his next words might be the most important he'd ever spoken, "what if someone wanted to help your family in a really big way? What would you want them to do?" The little girl considered this question with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice weighing a constitutional matter. She set down the block she'd been holding and folded her small hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful and mature beyond her years. "I think," she said slowly, each word chosen with deliberate care, "I would want them to be part of our family for real, because the very best kind of help comes from people who love you, not just people who feel sorry for you." That's when Bob realized that this remarkable 6-year-old had just asked him the most important question of his entire life without actually asking it at all. But Sarah's reaction to her daughter's innocent wisdom would complicate everything in ways none of them could have anticipated. Sarah's laptop closed with a sharp, decisive click that echoed through the play area like a door slamming shut. When she looked up, her expression had transformed from the soft attention she'd been giving to Maggie's words into something more guarded, more protective. The face of a mother who'd recognized danger and was preparing to defend her child from potential heartbreak. "Maggie, sweetie," she said in that carefully controlled tone parents use when they need to manage a situation without alarming their children, "why don't you go see if the nurses have any new puzzles in the activity room? I think I saw them bring in some new ones this morning." Bob recognized the tactical maneuver immediately. The same kind of calculated removal of variables he might use in a delicate business negotiation. Maggie, with the intuitive understanding children have about adult tensions, gave them both a searching look before nodding and skipping away, but not before giving Bob's hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. Once they were alone, Sarah moved her chair closer to his, her posture shifting into something more confrontational. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice carrying a firmness that hadn't been there before, I need to be completely direct with you about something. I genuinely appreciate the kindness you've shown to Maggie. I really do. She hasn't had many positive male influences in her life, and seeing her light up around you has been wonderful. But if you're thinking about making some kind of grand gesture, I wasn't necessarily, Bob began, but Sarah held up her hand with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult conversations. Please let me finish this, she said, and Bob could hear years of hard-won experience in her tone. I've been a single mother for 4 years now, ever since Maggie's father decided that having a sick child wasn't the life he'd signed up for. In that time, I've learned to recognize a particular look people get when they encounter our situation. The pity, the desire to swoop in and rescue us, the need to be the hero in someone else's story. Bob felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, a recognition that perhaps his motivations weren't as pure as he'd believed them to be. I've also learned, Sarah continued, her voice growing softer but no less firm, that those feelings, however genuine they might be in the moment, usually don't survive contact with the messy, complicated reality of actually being part of someone else's life. And when those good intentions inevitably fade and people move on to their real lives, the ones who get hurt are always the children who believed in the fairy tale. The words stung because Bob could hear the truth in them, could recognize the voice of someone who'd been disappointed before by promises that weren't kept. You think I'm here out of pity? He asked quietly. Sarah's expression softened slightly, and Bob caught a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath her protective anger. I think you're a genuinely kind man who's clearly going through something difficult in your own life, and I think that helping us makes you feel better about whatever you're facing. But Maggie doesn't understand those kinds of complications. She's already attached to you, and when you inevitably move on to your regular life, to your business meetings, and your real responsibilities. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Bob could hear the unspoken words, "You'll break her heart, and I'll be the one left to pick up the pieces." You don't know anything about my real life, Bob said, and there was more defensiveness in his voice than he'd intended. Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been exhaustion. Don't I? I know you're wealthy. That's obvious from everything about you. From your clothes to the way you carry yourself to the fact that you can spend days at a hospital without anyone wondering where you are or what work you're missing. I know you're probably used to solving problems with money, used to being able to write a check and make difficulties disappear. And I know that eventually, probably sooner than later, you'll realize that our problems can't be solved that way. Bob stared at her, seeing not just protective anger, but the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of someone who'd fought every battle alone for too long. This was a woman who'd learned not to trust in rescue because rescue so often came with conditions, with expectations, with complications that made the cure worse than the disease. You're right about some things, he said finally, choosing his words with the same care he'd use in a crucial negotiation. I am wealthy. I do usually try to solve problems with money, because that's what I know how to do. And yes, I'm going through something incredibly difficult. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. But you're wrong about one thing. I'm not here because helping you and Maggie makes me feel better about my situation. I'm here because your daughter asked me a question that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since the moment she said it. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing some of the defensiveness. She asked if I had children, Bob continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion. When I told her no, she said that sometimes families come together in different ways, like puzzle pieces that find each other when you're not looking. I've spent my entire adult life building a business empire, accumulating wealth, creating something that should have meant everything to me. But I've had no one to share it with, no one to leave it to, no real reason for any of it beyond the momentum of success itself. Sarah was very still now, watching him with those same intelligent eyes that Maggie had inherited, and Bob could see her trying to decide whether to trust what she was hearing. "The truth is," Bob said, taking the deepest breath of his life, "I have terminal pancreatic cancer, 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm fortunate. I came to this hospital thinking I might make a donation and feel better about dying alone in that mansion of mine. Instead, I met a little girl who's teaching me what it actually means to be alive." Sarah's face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, compassion, fear, and something else that Bob couldn't quite identify, but that looked almost like recognition. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and Bob could hear that she meant it completely. But what she said next would force Bob to confront the one thing he'd been avoiding since receiving his diagnosis: the question of what kind of legacy he truly wanted to leave behind. "I'm sorry," Sarah said again, softer this time, and Bob could see tears gathering in her eyes, not just sympathy, but the deep understanding that only comes from facing mortality alongside someone you love. "I had no idea. I assumed you were just another wealthy person looking for a tax deduction or a way to feel good about yourself." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Both were facing the unthinkable in their own ways, both trying to protect the people they loved from truths too heavy for anyone to bear alone. "How much does Maggie know about her prognosis?" Bob asked finally, his voice careful and gentle. Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp, the sound of someone who'd been carrying an impossible burden for too long. "Everything and nothing," she replied, staring at her hands. "She knows she's sick. She knows the treatments are expensive and difficult. She knows I worry constantly and that I cry when I think she's sleeping, but she doesn't know." Sarah's voice caught, and she had to stop to compose herself. Bob waited, recognizing the struggle of someone trying to voice their worst fears. "She doesn't know that Dr. Martinez pulled me aside yesterday after you left," Sarah continued, her words coming out in a rush, as if she needed to say them quickly or not at all. "She doesn't know that even with this experimental treatment, this incredibly expensive treatment that we somehow now have anonymous funding for, her chances are still less than 30%. The number hit Bob like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making him understand why Sarah had been so fierce in protecting her daughter from false hope. This brave, wise little girl who taught him about family and puzzle pieces was facing odds that would terrify the most seasoned gambler. "She doesn't know that I've already remortgaged our house twice," Sarah continued, the words pouring out now as if a dam had burst. "She doesn't know that I sold my car last month and have been taking 3 different buses to get here each day. She doesn't know that I lie awake every night staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to pay for treatments that might not even work, trying to decide whether bankrupting our entire family is worth a 30% chance." Bob wanted to interrupt, to tell her about the anonymous donation he'd already made, but something held him back. Perhaps an instinct that she needed to finish saying these things that had clearly been weighing on her soul. "And she definitely doesn't know," Sarah said, looking directly at him with eyes that held both desperation and something that looked almost like hope, "that I've been praying every single night for someone exactly like you to walk into our lives." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession, raw and vulnerable and brave. "I've been so angry at God," Sarah whispered, tears flowing freely now. "Angrier than I've ever been about anything in my life. Angry that he would let my beautiful, innocent baby suffer like this. Angry that her father could just walk away when things got difficult, leaving us to face this nightmare alone. Angry that I have to choose between keeping our house and keeping my daughter alive. Angry that love isn't enough to cure cancer. Angry that being a good mother doesn't automatically protect your child from the worst things in the world." Bob felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. Not the physical pain of his cancer, but something deeper and more essential. The wall he'd built around his heart since Catherine's death 15 years ago, the barrier that had kept him safe and successful, and utterly isolated from the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of caring about other people. "Sarah," he said carefully, aware that his next words might be the most important he'd ever spoken. "What if I told you that I could take care of all the medical expenses? All of them. The experimental treatment, the follow-up care, whatever additional treatments she might need, college tuition when she beats this thing. What if money was never a consideration again?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, studying his face with the practiced wariness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. "I'd say that sounds like charity," she replied slowly, "and I honestly don't know if I could accept something like that. My pride has kept us going when everything else failed." "What if it wasn't charity?" Bob asked, leaning forward slightly. "What if it was something else entirely?" Sarah looked at him sharply, her intelligent eyes searching his face for clues about where this conversation was heading. "What are you saying exactly?" Bob took the deepest breath of his life, about to voice the idea that had been forming in his mind since Maggie had built her house for families that didn't match the regular way. "I'm saying that I have 6 months to live, and enough money to last 6 lifetimes. I'm saying that your daughter has shown me what it means to have hope again, what it feels like to be needed by someone who isn't after my money, or my connections, or my influence. And I'm saying that maybe, if you're willing to take a chance on a dying stranger, we can help each other in ways that go far beyond financial transactions." Sarah was very quiet, and Bob could see her mind working, weighing possibilities against dangers, hope against the hard-learned lessons of disappointment. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Bob looked toward the play area, where Maggie was now reading a picture book to her teddy bear, her small voice carrying clearly as she gave different characters distinct voices and personalities, her face animated with joy despite everything she was facing. "I'm proposing," he said slowly, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime of loneliness and a future of limited time, "that we become the family Maggie built with those blocks. I'm proposing that instead of dying alone in that tomb of a mansion, I spend my remaining months helping to raise the most remarkable little girl I've ever met. And I'm proposing that when I'm gone, neither of you will ever have to worry about money or security or having a roof over your heads ever again." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and Bob could see the war being fought behind her eyes. Hope battling with fear, desperation wrestling with the pride that had sustained her through the darkest times. But what she said next would reveal a secret about their family that would change everything Bob thought he understood about fate, coincidence, and the mysterious ways that lives intersect when people need each other most. Sarah took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a small, creased photograph that looked like it had been handled thousands of times over the years. She stared at it for a moment, as if gathering courage, then handed it to Bob with the careful reverence of someone sharing their most precious treasure. Bob looked down at the photograph and felt the world tilt beneath him. It showed a much younger Sarah, radiant in a wedding dress, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a familiar smile. But it wasn't the wedding scene that made Bob's heart stop. It was the man standing behind the couple, clearly the best man, his arm around the groom's shoulders, in a gesture of brotherly affection. It was his own face staring back at him, 20 years younger, but unmistakably him. "Michael Chen was my husband," Sarah said softly, watching Bob's face with careful attention. "He used to tell me stories about his college roommate at Harvard, his best friend who stood by him through everything. The brilliant business student who became like a brother to him. The man who was supposed to be Maggie's godfather, but who disappeared from our lives after the wedding because success and wealth pulled him in different directions. Bob's hands shook as he held the photograph, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. Michael Chen, brilliant, funny, loyal Michael, who'd been more brother than friend during their Harvard years. Michael who'd begged him to be his best man, who'd talked endlessly about the amazing woman he was going to marry, who'd named him as godfather to the children he hoped to have someday. "I remember you," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You gave the most beautiful speech at our wedding about brotherhood and chosen family. You said that some bonds are stronger than blood, that love creates connections that last forever." Michael was so proud to have you there, so happy that his best friend was sharing the biggest day of his life. "Sarah, Bob's voice cracked, but she held up her hand gently. "After the wedding, you sent a few emails, called once or twice. But then your business took off. You became this incredibly successful mogul, and gradually the communication stopped. Michael understood. He said success required sacrifices, that you were living the dream you'd both talked about in college." Her voice grew softer, tinged with old sadness. "But when Maggie was born, when Michael got diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 32, when he started forgetting pieces of himself every day, he would ask for you. Even as his memory faded, he remembered his best friend, Bob Harrison. Bob felt like he was drowning in guilt and regret. I didn't know he was sick. I had no idea. How could you?" Sarah's voice held no accusation, only a weary understanding. "We lost touch. People drift apart. Michael never wanted to burden you with our problems, never wanted to seem like he was asking for help from his successful friend." She paused, looking toward where Maggie was still playing. "He died when Maggie was 2. The last coherent thing he said was that he hoped someday you'd meet his daughter because he knew you'd love her as much as he did." The photograph slipped from Bob's numb fingers, fluttering to the floor between them. 20 years of missed opportunities, of chosen isolation, of prioritizing business over the relationships that actually mattered. He'd been godfather to this remarkable child and hadn't even known she existed. "When you walked into that waiting room 3 days ago," Sarah said, reaching down to retrieve the photograph, "when Maggie asked if she could sit with you, and you said yes with such kindness, I knew before you even said your name. You have the same eyes Michael always described, the same way of tilting your head when you're really listening to someone." Bob looked at her through tears he didn't remember starting to shed. "All this time she's been right here. Michael's daughter. And I never—" Michael used to say that everything happens for a reason, that the universe has a way of bringing the right people together when they need each other most. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe this isn't coincidence. Maybe this is Michael's way of making sure his 2 favorite people found each other when you both needed it most." Bob stared across the play area at Maggie, seeing Michael's intelligence in her eyes, Michael's kindness in her smile, Michael's generous spirit in the way she'd reached out to a lonely stranger. This wasn't just any sick child he'd randomly encountered. This was his best friend's daughter, the little girl he should have been protecting and loving all along. "She doesn't know," Sarah said quietly. "About you, I mean. She's too young to understand the connection, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I should tell her. But now everything makes sense," Bob whispered, understanding finally why this little girl had reached straight into his heart from the very first moment. Why her words about families and puzzle pieces had felt like coming home. Why being near her didn't feel like charity or pity, but like finding a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. But what neither of them realized was that Maggie had been listening from across the room, and what she'd heard would change everything once again. "Mr. Bob?" Maggie's small voice cut through their intense conversation like a bell, startling both adults. Neither had noticed her approach, so absorbed were they in the revelations that had just reshifted the foundation of everything they thought they understood about their situation. Bob quickly wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself, but Maggie's perceptive gaze missed nothing. She stood in front of them, holding her teddy bear, a worn brown creature with one missing eye that she'd introduced to him yesterday as Dr. Snuggles. And her expression held that particular seriousness that children get when they sense the adults around them are discussing something important and possibly frightening. "Why are you crying?" And she asked, settling herself on the floor between their chairs with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. "Are you sad because you're sick like me?" Sarah and Bob exchanged glances, both suddenly aware that they were in uncharted territory. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that the stranger she'd befriended was actually connected to the father she barely remembered? How do you make sense of coincidences that seem too meaningful to be accidental? "Maggie," Sarah began carefully, "do you remember the stories I've told you about Daddy, about his best friend from college?" The Maggie nodded solemnly, her fingers absently stroking Dr. Snuggles' remaining ear. "You said Daddy had a friend who was like a brother, and that he was supposed to be my special uncle, but that grown-up life got too busy and complicated." "That's right," Sarah said softly. "Well, sweetheart, sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways. Sometimes people find their way back to each other when they need each other most." Maggie looked from her mother to Bob, her intelligent eyes processing information with the rapid clarity that only children possess. "Mr. Bob," she said finally, "are you my daddy's best friend? Are you my uncle who got lost?" Bob felt his heart break and mend simultaneously. This remarkable little girl, Michael's daughter, his goddaughter, was looking at him with such hope, such trust, such willingness to accept that the family she'd been building in her imagination with blocks might actually be possible. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am. And I'm so very sorry that I got lost for so long." Maggie considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. "That's okay," she said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes people get lost, but the important thing is when they find their way home. Mommy says home isn't a place, it's the people who love you." She stood up and walked over to Bob's chair, then climbed into his lap with the complete trust that only children can give. As she settled against his chest, Bob felt something profound shift inside him. Not just emotional, but cellular, as if every atom in his body was recognizing a truth that went deeper than conscious thought. "Doctor, Snuggles thinks you should stay with us," Maggie announced, holding up her teddy bear as if for confirmation. "He's very smart about these things. He says families aren't just about being born together. They're about choosing to love each other every day." Bob looked over Maggie's head at Sarah, seeing his own wonder and disbelief reflected in her eyes. This child, facing her own mortality with incredible courage, was teaching them both about what really mattered in life. "Maggie," Bob said carefully, "what would you think if I told you that I wanted to be part of your family for real? Not just visiting, but actually living together, taking care of each other." Maggie pulled back to look at him directly, her brown eyes, so much like Michael's, serious and searching. "Would that make Mommy not worry so much about money? Would that make you not have to be sad and alone in your big house?" "Yes," Bob said simply. "I think it would help with both of those things." "And would you read me stories every night, and help me with my puzzles, and be there when I wake up scared from the medicine dreams?" Bob's throat closed completely. This little girl wasn't asking for toys or treats or grand gestures. She was asking for presence, for constancy, for the simple daily acts of love that create real families. "Every single night," he promised, "for as long as I'm able." Maggie seemed to consider this, then nodded decisively. "Okay then, but we have to do it the right way. We have to make it official and legal and everything, so nobody can say we're not a real family." Sarah laughed, despite her tears. "Maggie, what do you mean by official and legal?" "Well," Maggie said, settling back against Bob's chest as if she belonged there, "I think Uncle Bob should adopt me, like in the movies. And maybe he should marry you too, Mommy, because then we'd all have the same last name and everything would be perfect." The suggestion hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful, fragile, and impossible to ignore. But before either adult could respond, Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway with an expression that would change everything they thought they knew about Maggie's prognosis. Dr. Martinez stood in the doorway of the play area, his expression an unusual mixture of excitement and professional caution that neither Sarah nor Bob had seen before. In his hands were several folders and what appeared to be fresh test results, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was the bearer of significant news. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice carefully controlled, but with an underlying current of something that sounded almost like barely contained joy. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with you about Maggie's latest blood work. The results just came in from this morning's tests." Sarah immediately tensed, her body language shifting into the defensive posture Bob had learned to recognize, the stance of a mother bracing herself for another devastating blow. After years of bad news and declining numbers, Sarah had learned to expect the worst from medical consultations. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipated grief. But Dr. Martinez's expression surprised them both. "Nothing's wrong," he said, his professional composure beginning to crack slightly. "In fact, something quite remarkable appears to be happening. Maggie's white blood cell count has improved dramatically since starting the experimental treatment. More than we've seen in any patient this quickly." Bob felt Maggie shift in his lap, her small body becoming alert and attentive. Despite being only 6, she'd learned to read the subtle cues in adult conversations about her condition, and she could clearly sense that this conversation was different from the usual grim discussions about her prognosis. "What does that mean exactly?" Bob found himself asking, his business mind automatically seeking specific data and concrete information. Dr. Martinez pulled up 3 chairs, settling himself across from them with the deliberate movements of someone about to deliver information that required careful explanation. "The experimental treatment we discussed, the one that Boston Children's Research Center has been developing, appears to be working far more effectively in Maggie's case than we anticipated." He opened the folder and spread several charts and test results across the small play table between them. To Bob and Sarah, the numbers and graphs were largely meaningless, but Dr. Martinez's excitement was unmistakable. "When we first discussed this treatment option," he continued, "I told you that patients with Maggie's specific type and stage of leukemia typically showed a 30% response rate. But Maggie's numbers suggest she's responding at a level we might classify as exceptional, perhaps even extraordinary." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that while we need to continue monitoring her carefully, and while we're still in the early stages of treatment, the initial indicators suggest that Maggie may be one of the lucky few who responds remarkably well to this particular therapy." "Doctor." Martinez leaned forward, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine human joy. "Her cancer markers have dropped by 60% in just 2 weeks. That's the kind of response we might hope to see after months of traditional treatment." Maggie, who had been listening with the focused attention that serious illness had taught her to give to medical discussions, suddenly sat up straighter in Bob's lap. "Does that mean I might not die?" she asked with the direct simplicity that only children can bring to life's biggest questions. Dr. Martinez's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Maggie, it means that your body is fighting this illness much better than we expected. It means that the medicine is helping you get stronger, and that we have very good reasons to be hopeful about your future." Bob felt tears streaming down his face, not the tears of grief and regret that had marked the past few days, but tears of pure, overwhelming relief and joy. This remarkable little girl, Michael's daughter, his goddaughter, who had found her way back into his life just when they both needed each other most, might actually have a future ahead of her. Sarah was sobbing openly now, the careful control she'd maintained for months finally cracking under the weight of unexpected hope. "How sure are you?" she managed to ask between tears. "How confident can we be?" "Medicine is never about certainties, Doctor." Martinez replied gently, "But I can tell you that in 15 years of pediatric oncology, I've rarely seen such positive early indicators. If Maggie continues to respond this well, we'll be looking at a very different conversation about her long-term prognosis." Maggie, with the resilience that had carried her through everything, suddenly brightened with an idea that was purely, wonderfully 6-year-old in its logic. "Does this mean we can still be a family?" she asked, looking between Bob and Sarah. "Because now maybe I'll be around long enough to grow up and everything?" Bob hugged her tighter, overwhelmed by the simple way she'd connected her improving health to their ability to build a life together. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means we can be a family for a very long time." But as they celebrated this miraculous turn of events, none of them noticed the figure watching from the hallway, someone whose appearance would threaten to destroy everything they were building together. The celebration of Maggie's improving prognosis was interrupted by a voice that made Sarah freeze completely, her face draining of all color as if she'd seen a ghost. Bob felt her entire body go rigid beside him, and Maggie's happy chatter died away as she sensed the sudden tension that had filled the room like a toxic cloud. "Well, isn't this touching?" came a male voice from the doorway, dripping with sarcasm and barely controlled anger. "One big happy family, playing house in the children's hospital." And Bob turned to see a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed but disheveled, with the particular combination of arrogance and desperation that Bob had learned to recognize in failed business ventures. There was something familiar about his features, the same bone structure as Maggie, the same dark hair. And Bob realized with a sinking heart that this must be David Chen, Maggie's father. "David," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" David stepped into the room, his movements aggressive and territorial. "I'm visiting my daughter, who I just learned is apparently doing much better, thanks to some mysterious anonymous benefactor who paid for her treatment." His eyes fixed on Bob with obvious suspicion and hostility. Funny thing about anonymous donations, they usually aren't as anonymous as people think. Dr. Martinez, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden family drama, began gathering his papers. "Perhaps this conversation would be better held in private," he suggested diplomatically. "Oh no," David said, his voice growing louder. "I think this conversation needs to happen right here, right now. Because apparently while I've been trying to get my life back together, my ex-wife has been playing house with some sugar daddy who thinks he can buy his way into my family." Maggie pressed closer to Bob, her small body trembling. "Mommy, who is that man?" she asked in a small voice. Bob's heart broke at the question. This child, who remembered nothing of her father due to his abandonment when she was diagnosed, was now being confronted by a stranger claiming parental rights. "Maggie," Sarah said carefully, this is David, your biological father." David's face twisted with pain and anger. "Biological father? I'm her father, period, and I've come to take her home where she belongs." Bob stood up slowly, still holding Maggie, his business instincts kicking in. He recognized the signs of someone who'd heard about money and wanted their share. "Mr. Chen," he said calmly, "I think there might be some misunderstanding." "Don't you dare patronize me," David snapped. "I know exactly what's happening here." Some rich old man thinks he can swoop in and play savior, maybe buy himself a ready-made family. Well, that's not how it works. She's my daughter, and I have rights." Sarah found her voice, standing up with a strength Bob hadn't seen from her before. "Rights?" she said, her tone incredulous. "You walked away, David. When the doctors first said the word cancer, you packed your bags and left. You haven't sent a birthday card, a Christmas present, or a single child support payment in 4 years." "I was young, I was scared," David began, but Sarah cut him off. "You were 28 years old, not some teenager. You made a choice to abandon your sick daughter because it was too hard, too expensive, too inconvenient for the life you wanted to live." Bob could see the real David emerging now, not a father concerned about his child's welfare, but someone who'd heard about significant money and wanted to ensure he got his share. The kind of person Bob had dealt with countless times in business, people who saw opportunity in other people's generosity. "That was different," David said, his voice taking on a wheedling quality. "I was dealing with my own problems, but I'm better now. I'm ready to be a father. And I don't think it's appropriate for my daughter to be living with some stranger, no matter how much money he has." Maggie, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, suddenly spoke up with the clear, carrying voice of someone much older than her 6 years. "You're not my daddy," she said firmly. "Daddies don't leave when their little girls are sick. Daddies stay and read stories and hold hands in the scary places." The simple statement hit David like a slap, and Bob saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "Look, sweetheart," David said, attempting a gentler tone but failing to hide the manipulation beneath it. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm here now. And I think you'd be much happier living in a normal family situation, not with some stranger who's just trying to buy your affection." But Maggie's response would reveal just how much she truly understood about love, family, and what it meant to be someone's daughter. Maggie slipped down from Bob's arms and walked directly to David, her small chin raised with a dignity that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Bob watched, amazed by her courage, as this 6-year-old girl faced down the man who should have been her protector, but had instead become a source of fear and confusion. "I don't know you," she said simply, her voice clear and unwavering. "But I know what daddies are supposed to do, because Mommy told me stories about my real daddy, the one who died when I was little. Real daddies don't scare their little girls. Real daddies don't make their mummies cry. And real daddies don't come back only when there's money involved." David's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Now listen here, young lady." "No," Maggie interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "You listen. Uncle Bob held my hand on the very first day I met him, when I was sad and scared. He cried with me. He reads me stories and helps me build things and makes Mommy smile for the first time in forever. He doesn't love me because someone paid him to. He loves me because that's what families do." Bob felt his heart swell with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. This remarkable child was defending their newfound family with a wisdom that put most adults to shame. Sarah stepped forward, placing her hands protectively on Maggie's shoulders. "David, you gave up your parental rights when you walked away. Legally and morally, you have no claim here. If you're genuinely interested in being part of Maggie's life, which I doubt, then you can go through the proper legal channels, but you will not terrorize my daughter or disrupt her treatment." "Our daughter," David corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," came an unexpected voice from the doorway. Dr. Martinez had returned, and his expression was grimmer than Bob had ever seen it. "Actually, Mr. Chen, I need to inform you that you're not listed as an emergency contact. You're not authorized to receive medical information about this patient, and hospital security has been notified of your presence." David's bravado began to crumble. "You can't keep me away from my own child." "Actually, I can and I will," Dr. Martinez replied firmly. This is a children's hospital, and we have strict policies about protecting our patients from situations that might compromise their care or emotional well-being. Your daughter is recovering from a serious illness, and any disruption to her treatment environment is medically inadvisable. Bob watched as David's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the desperate, selfish man beneath. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at Bob. "I know your type. Rich men who think they can buy anything they want, including other people's families, but she's still my daughter, and I'll prove it." "Actually," Bob said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to winning important battles, "she's not just your daughter anymore. As of this morning, I've initiated formal adoption proceedings, with Sarah's full consent and Maggie's explicit request. My legal team is preparing the paperwork as we speak." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, but also like a promise of protection. David stared at him with naked hatred. "You can't do that." "I'm her biological father." "You were her biological father," Sarah corrected, "but you abandoned her when she needed you most. The courts don't look favorably on parents who reappear only when there's financial benefit involved." Maggie, who had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of someone far older than her years, suddenly walked over to Bob and took his hand. "Uncle Bob," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "when you adopt me, will that make you my real daddy? Like, forever and always?" Bob knelt down to her level, looking directly into those wise brown eyes that reminded him so much of Michael. "Yes, sweetheart, forever and always. Nothing and no one will ever be able to change that." Maggie nodded solemnly, then turned to face David one last time. "I already have a daddy," she announced with finality. "His name is Bob Harrison, and he chose to love me even though he didn't have to. That makes him more my daddy than you ever were." David opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Martinez stepped forward with two security guards who had apparently been waiting in the hallway. "Mr. Chen, Doctor," Martinez said formally, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. If you wish to pursue any legal action regarding your daughter, you're welcome to do so through appropriate channels. But this hospital is a treatment facility, not a courtroom." As David was escorted away, still muttering threats and accusations, Bob felt Maggie's small hand squeeze his tightly. "Uncle Bob," she whispered, "are we still going to be a family? Even though that scary man said we couldn't?" Bob picked her up, holding her close as Sarah came to stand beside them, forming a protective circle around this brave little girl who had already endured more than most adults ever would. "Yes, sweetheart," he said firmly, "we're going to be a family, and nobody is going to take that away from us." But as they stood there together, none of them realized that David's threats were more serious than they appeared, and that the legal battle ahead would test every bond they'd built in ways they never could have imagined.